Simon Peter. We know more about Jesus' interaction with Peter than any other disciple. There are more events that are connected to Peter. There are more words that Peter spoke. Reggie, is that TV in the back on? Right, could you turn that TV on for me? There are more words that Peter spoke. There is this information about Peter, and I think it's there because I think Peter's experience pretty accurately depicts our experience as we begin this walk with Jesus. And I think there are a lot of things that Peter does that we would have done. I think there's a lot of things that the mistakes that he made that we would have made. And there's all these events where, for example, Peter steps out on faith, right? We'll talk about that this morning, walking on the water. But then he steps out on faith, and a few chapters after that, he displays this lack of faith. He says the exact correct thing. I mean, he says the right thing, and you look at Peter and you think, oh, right, he's about to get it. And then right after that, he says the thing that is just about as wrong as anything that you could say. He looks at a significant event in the life of Jesus and he understands it. He says, this is what's going on. But then he misses a significant event in the life of Jesus that we thought, surely by now, Peter, you would have had this figured out. And I don't think Peter was alone in the disciples. I think there were a lot of disciples who were scratching their heads about a lot of things. But I think Peter was just the one who was more vocal. And I think he probably had a really incredible personality. I think when we meet Peter, we're going to look at him and say, I kind of understand now. But why he went through all of those kind of things. And so there's times his faith is just, it's amazing. And then there are times that Peter will do something and we'll just kind of look and we'll just kind of shake our head in amazement and think, Peter, what are you thinking? What are you doing? And so this morning, we're going to look at a couple of those. This started out, just a little aside, this started out as one sermon, okay? And it's developed into about 4 sermons, maybe 3. So what I had envisioned this morning, this kind of completely changed as I've kind of looked through the life of Jesus and the life of Peter. So Peter, the first impression we have of Peter is this guy who leaves everything to follow Jesus. And the text is pretty clear. Peter left everything. And I don't know why just Peter, Andrew left everything. It says that James and John left everything. It says Matthew, the tax collector, left everything. There ought to be a lesson in there for us, the leave everything kind of thing. And so Peter is this individual who leaves everything to follow Jesus. When you start putting all the Gospels together, it's kind of a really interesting little story as it kind of develops. Andrew, who is Peter's brother, is a disciple of John the Baptist. I don't know if you picked that up in the text, but it's in there. Andrew is a disciple of John the Baptist. One day, Andrew is with John the Baptist. Jesus walks by, and Andrew says, and John the Baptist says, look, the Lamb of God. And Andrew and another disciple, it didn't tell us who that was, they asked to go with Jesus for the day. And that must have been some kind of day, right? You see Jesus walking by. John the Baptist says, hey, look, the Lamb of God. And you say, hey, can I just hang out with you for the day? And he's like, yeah, just come on, man. Let's see what's happening. And so that's a Greg Smith paraphrase, by the way. But you hang out for the day with Jesus. So Andrew spends the day hanging out with Jesus. And it says that he goes and tells his brother, Peter. There's a time that Jesus says, and when you start combining Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'm not sure exactly in chronology how all this works out. It's a different sermon, different time, okay? But I know if all of these are one instance or 2, but Jesus sees Andrew and Peter, and they're cleaning their nets. They're fishermen. They're casting nets, cleaning net. And it says they were casting a net because they were fishermen. And Jesus says, follow me. And it says they left everything to follow him. In another occasion, or maybe the same occasion, just described differently, Jesus is teaching a group of people. and the crowd's too big, so he needs to get into a boat to push out from the shore to teach, and he gets into a boat, and the boat belongs to Simon Peter. And he puts out from the shore, and Jesus begins teaching the people, and he teaches the people sitting in Simon's boat. I mean, can you imagine what that looks like, right? All you go down on one of your camping trips, and you're all crowded around on the shore, and, I can't stand up to preach, so I say, hey, get out in a boat, and I get out in the boat, preach to you. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? I'd like to do that sometime. But anyway, after Jesus speaks, he says, put out in deep water and let down your nets. And Peter's like, man, we fishing all night. We caught anything. But because you say so, again, the Greg Smith paraphrase, I'll do it. So they go out and they catch so many fish that they can't get the nets up. The nets start to break. They got fishing partners. Do you know Peter and Andrew had fishing partners? Yeah? Y'all can answer this out loud. Who were Peter and Andrew's fishing partners? James and John. So they called James and John. They all come over. They got this huge amount of fish, and they pull them up to the shore. And Jesus says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. And it says he loves everything and follows him. Kind of interesting. They left a lot of fish behind for somebody to sell too, didn't they? Help take care of their families, I guess. There's a couple of questions when I read through that. No, the first one is about Andrew. Who is your Andrew? Do you have an Andrew? The guy who came and told you, or the girl who came, the woman who came, the man who came, whoever that came and told you about Jesus. Who's your Andrew? It's kind of an interesting question, isn't it? Andrew goes and tells Peter, hey, I think we found the Messiah. Who's your Andrew? And it might be your family. It might be somebody you met. I don't know who your Andrew is. I just want you to think about who's your Andrew. But here's another question for you. Who are you an Andrew for? Yeah, have you been Andrew to any Peters where you have said, hey, I think we found the Messiah. I think we found Jesus. Because you need to have an Andrew, and you need to be an Andrew to someone else. And so Peter leaves everything to follow Jesus. Now, when I read that, I think that is an incredible act of faith, isn't it? Incredible act of faith to leave everything to follow Jesus. And when you hear that, when you hear he left everything to follow Jesus, what comes up in your mind? I mean, do you think he ever talked to his family again? Oh, I'm sure he talked to his family. In fact, it says that Peter had a believing wife. Paul says, couldn't I be like Peter and other disciples who take along believing wives? So when Peter went to do missionary stuff, his wife obviously traveled with him some. It made me ask a question that's never in the text, but I guess I can ask it just knowing that I can't answer it. Can you do that? Can you ask a question you know you can't answer? I wonder if she followed Peter and Jesus. I wonder if she was one of the women who was, there's women who traveled with them as well. I wonder if she always traveled with Peter. I have no idea. It doesn't say anything in the Gospels about it. Just a thought. What did he leave behind? What did he leave behind? He had a wife who traveled with him. Do you know Peter had a house? Anybody know Peter had a house? Peter had a house. Jesus went to Simon's house where he cured Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. So he had a house. He had a career, right? He had a boat. He had nets. He had fishing partners. He had a wife. And he left everything to follow Jesus. I don't think that means he never talked to his wife again. She probably traveled with him. I don't know that he sold his house. Never says that he sold his house, right? But he had, so that's terminology to say he was committed to Jesus and he followed Jesus, the most important thing to him. I think it's terminology for being totally committed to Jesus. And that makes me ask a really hard question. What keeps me from being totally committed to Jesus? You say, well, Greg, it can't be your career. Your career is preaching, right? Well, yeah, but it could. It could, honestly. Is it family? Man, I would hope that if I ended up being a missionary or I had to go off and travel or y'all sent me to some distant country to preach about Jesus, I'm kind of hoping Diane goes with me if that's all right with y'all. Okay, I'd kind of like to have one of those believing wives who travels with you. I wouldn't want to leave her behind. Don't know if Peter did that or not. Man, how long? Peter had fished how long without catching anything that day? All night. Then he goes out and he catches, like a tremendous catch of fish, right? Like so many that the nets are breaking. That's a lot of fish. That's a lot of money. That's a pretty big business deal to leave on, isn't it? It's like the biggest sale of your career, and then Jesus says, hey, why don't you come follow me? And you're thinking, well, I just think I got successful, right? I think I just turned the corner on this business, Jesus. He says, well, why don't you leave that to somebody else? And why don't you come follow me? Wow, what if Jesus calls you right after your greatest career success? Would you be willing to go? You think Peter was afraid of change? Guy walks up and says, hey, I want you to follow me. And you pull your boat up on the shore and you start to follow Jesus. You think you'd be apprehensive? I think I would be. I think I'd be very apprehensive. Do you remember what Peter says in the boat after the big catch of fish? Lord, I'm a sinful man. Man, that's some kind of statement, isn't it? Lord, I am a sinful man. Who does Jesus change? He changes sinful people. See, I think the thing about Peter is Peter at that moment, he recognized his need. He knew he needed Jesus. He knew what Jesus could do for him. You think anywhere down the line, Peter thought, I'm really not going to turn into this fisher of man that Jesus has promised. I'm thinking he probably did. I'm thinking probably, and this is a little just, give me some room to move with the text, right? I got a feeling if Peter's like most people, there were a couple of nights after Jesus had said, Peter, don't you get it at all, man? I think there were probably a couple of nights Peter was probably laying there. I don't know if he slept on the ground or, his head's on a rock. I don't know how any of that worked. And he's probably thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to get this whole disciple stuff. You ever feel that way in your walk? You're just sitting there at night and you're thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to latch on to this whole disciple stuff so much. Here's the interesting thing. When the process is over, Jesus makes exactly out of Peter what he promised. When your process is over, you know what God will make out of you? God will make exactly out of you what he has promised, even though you're going to struggle some along the way. So, man, what are you unwilling to leave behind? What is it that is keeping you from making that total commitment to Jesus? And when Jesus asks the question, and he just makes the statement, he says, follow me. It's not really a question, even though I put it up there as a question. How are you going to answer that question? Are you going to follow? Are you going to leave the boat? Are you going to recognize that you're a sinful man and leave the boat and follow the master? Or are you going to sit there and say, God, I just had my biggest catch of fish. I think I'll just stay where I am and where I am the most comfortable. Boy, then you get a little further in the life of Jesus and Peter. And Peter walks on the water. Man, that is an incredible thing, isn't it? Anybody here like to walk on water? I would like to walk on water. The one thing that is in the back of my head, okay, and I don't know why it's there. I don't think there's any traumatic experience that put it there. I have no idea why. I do not want to drown. I don't want to drown. When I die, I don't want to drown. Now, I don't know why. If you go kayaking with me, right, and the water's over my head, what do I have on, son? A life jacket. Yes, sir. I'm going to have one too. If there's current in the water right ahead, what will I have on? A life jacket. Why will I have on a life jacket? I don't want to drown. If I could walk on water, my kayaking experience would be over the top if I could just walk on water. But I can't. And there's Peter. And this is just a really great story when you think about it. So they're in the boat. They're going across the lake. Jesus has stayed behind to pray, by the way. So Jesus stays behind to pray. You get in the boat. You're sailing across the water, going across the sea. You look out and you see something on the water. Maybe it's another boat. You think, man, maybe it's a sea dragon. Then it gets close enough and you recognize, hey, that looks like Jesus. And you think, well, that's probably a ghost, right? It's probably a ghost on the water. And so he keeps walking. And you finally figure out that's Jesus walking across the water toward the boat. I mean, if you put yourself in that scenario, do any of you think that you would be just a tad surprised? I'm thinking, I've never seen Jesus walk on water, right? And I don't know that they had ever seen Jesus walk on water before that moment. Here comes Jesus walking across the water. And Peter, you got to love Peter, right? First he says, well, don't be afraid. It's just me. And then they're thinking, well, it don't really change that much. You got to love Peter. What does Peter say? Lord, if it's you, who else did he think it would be? If it's you, just command me to come out there with you. Greg Smith paraphrase again. And Jesus, Greg Smith paraphrase, says, well, come on, Peter. So Peter gets out of the boat, right? And he starts to walk across the water. And he's doing pretty good to the wind and the waves. And he gets to think, I'm sure he was thinking, I'm not really supposed to be walking on water. And at that moment, he begins to sink. And a couple of key things in there. How long does it take Jesus to rescue Peter when he starts to sink? Anybody remember the word in the text? It's a really important word. Immediately. He didn't say, well, I'm going to let him get neck deep before I said, no. Immediately, Jesus, I don't know how far he was down before he said, oh, help me, Jesus. But immediately, Jesus reaches down and rescues him, right? And we look at that and we say, well, Peter, why didn't you just keep walking? Why did you get to, why were you doubting? What were you afraid of? All right, when you're giving Peter all of that grief, there's a great Jimmy Bratcher song saying it's Get Out of the Boat. If you ever look up YouTube Jimmy Bratcher, he is a blues, he is a blues gospel player and lives over in Missouri. And he wrote this song, I don't know if he wrote it, he sang it, Get Out of the Boat. And it's a great song because you know what he says in the song, Get Out of the Boat? We're complaining that Peter's sinking. How many guys are still in the boat? 11 guys still in the boat. Didn't get out at all. Still sitting there thinking, well, look at Peter going across there. I don't know why all 12 didn't get out of the boat. Hey, Jesus, how about that'd be some kind of party when you're walking on the water party, right? And we look at Peter and we say, well, man, what were you afraid of? At least he was out of the boat. Do you ever take a risk? Or are you afraid to? Or don't want to? What will be your walking on water experience? What is the seemingly impossible thing that Jesus asked you to do? And you shake your head and you think, man, I can't do that. Boy, Jesus makes some tough statements, doesn't he? Unless you love me more than mother, father, sons, daughters, wives, you can't be my disciple. Now, I don't know what happens in your head when you lay down at night. Anybody ever laid down at night and contemplated that verse? Your little head hits the pillow, and you can't sleep, so you got to think about something. And all of a sudden, God just pops right in your head, that verse. You ever lay there thinking, I wonder if I really love Jesus more than Hot Babe? That's a tough question. I wonder if I love Jesus more than my kids. That's a tough question. I wonder if I love Jesus more than my parents. That's a tough question, isn't it? Can you take risk for Jesus? Can you make that kind of commitment? And you say, well, I'd make that kind of commitment, but when I jump out in commitment like that, I get afraid. You know, great faith leads to periods of fear. It just does. When you really trust God and you put it out there, great trust creates situations where you are afraid because now you kind of floated out there on the water, right? You kind of made a couple of those steps. And then you start seeing the wind and the waves, which is people saying, you can't be doing that kind of stuff. Or you can't, God's not really going to save you from that. You can't have that much faith in God. And we even think, man, am I doing the right thing? And it creates periods of fear. And it's just kind of this cycle. Faith leads to fear, where God rescues and leads to faith. So he walks on the water in chapter 14, and Jesus says, "Who am I?" In chapter 16, what does Peter say? "Oh, you're the Christ," right? Nobody else is answering, but Peter's answering. And we'll talk about that, but can you take risk? Because faith can create fear. See, this is, it doesn't matter what this is a picture of, okay? That's, I don't know, whatever you can say. That's a kind of a financial graph, right? What do you notice in that graph? So it's getting higher, right? So that's a good thing if you're investing in that. So it's getting higher. What do you notice about it? Oh, there's some dips, right? I mean, you get like in here, and it's like, oh, baby, I'm feeling good here, right? How am I feeling here? Whoa! You know, maybe that was the wrong company. That's actually currency trading, but maybe that was the wrong maybe that was the wrong trade. But which direction is it headed? Oh, it's headed up. But it's got periods, it's got valleys, it's got peaks. Corrections, yeah, some are market corrections, and some where some guy threw $4 billion into that fund that just dropped. Correction. Do you ever feel like that? Because if you were to graph me spiritually, that graph's going to need a lot more peaks and a lot more valleys. You know, I'm a volatile investment for God. I am a volatile investment. Which way am I headed? Well, so far I've been headed up, right? No market crash yet. Oh, some periods of correction. Yeah, some of them pretty big. But can you take a risk? See, what you can't do, you can't allow failure to discourage you. You're going to fail. There are going to be times you're just going to fall short. There are going to be times that you're Peter and you're walking on the water and then you're sinking. What if Peter had gotten back in that boat and said, "Okay, that's it. I can't walk on the water, I'm done. Jesus, you have tried and tried and tried to get me to see this stuff, but it's just not sinking in, and this is it. That's the last failure that I'm going to endure. That's the last time I'm going to step out, and I am done. I'm going to go home. I'm going to get my boat, and I'm going to go back to fishing." Church would have missed one of the greatest missionaries on the face of the planet if he had let failure discourage him. Do not let failure discourage. It's just part of our growth process. Because I really think Peter's failure increased his faith. I think that's why we get to chapter 16 and Peter can say, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." I wonder about that. Jesus sitting there and he said, "Who do people say I am?" Well, some people say this and some people say that. You know, some says Elijah, some one of the prophets. And Peter speaks up. And it's just me looking at text. I wonder why one of the other guys didn't say something. One of those who were saying, well, they say you're this and they say you're that. And I think it so accurately reflects our walk in the world. Because somebody will ask us a question and we'll say, well, so-and-so thinks this, and this person thinks that, and this news outlet says this, and this news outlet says that, and this person who's an expert says this, and this other person who's an expert, well, he kind of says this. And Peter just kind of said, do you think by that time Peter has formed his own opinion? I think by that time Peter has formed his own opinion. I think he's like, I don't care what all those other guys say. I know who you are. That's the Greg Smith paraphrase again, okay? But that's kind of the impression I get from Peter. Oh, yeah, I know what they're all saying, Jesus, but this is who you are, and God calls him blessed because he has come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. How do you get to that confession? How do you get to that point? Because if you look at Peter and you say, well, he knew that way back when he left the boat on the shore. I think when Peter left the boat on the shore, he thought, I have met somebody really unique and different, and this fellow wants me to follow, and I'm going to see where this goes. But I think Peter's view of Christ in Matthew 16 is far different from when he left his boat at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And I think we go through that journey. I'm not asking you when you first came to church. I'm not asking you what the first Bible class you ever sat in is or was. I'm not asking you the first time you got out your Bible to read or the first time you sat down to pray. I'm not asking you the first time that you thought, maybe this heaven and hell stuff is really kind of real and maybe there's something really unique about Jesus. When is the moment in your life that it dawned on you that Jesus is the Christ? When did that moment come? Or has it come into your life yet? And when it does enter into your life, how are you going to react to that statement? So just imagine this morning, instead of being in this auditorium, we're all down at the lake fishing. And by the way, it says in Ezekiel that there's a seashore and there are fishermen lined up on the seashore. Okay, so I'm with those guys. They're fishing with nets, by the way. They don't think it mentions anything about rod and reels, but they have nets. Okay, and there's a lot of fish. So all of that stuff is good, which means between now and the time I get to heaven, I've got to learn to throw a casting net, because if you see me try to do that, it is not pretty. All right, so I have to learn that skill. But there you are by the shore, casting your net. And Jesus comes along and he says, "Follow me." How would you answer the question? Because you're answering that question today. You realize that, don't you? You look out and you see Jesus walking on the water. You say, "Lord, if that's you," I don't know who else he thought it was. "Why don't you command me to come out there?" And Jesus says, "Well, come on. Come on." Are you a Peter and you step out of the boat, or are you 11 people who stay in the boat? And Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" In our world, we say, "Well, some people think you're just a myth. Some people think you didn't even really exist." Jesus, some people thought you were a pretty good teacher. They're not sure we've got any of your words right that we recorded on paper, but they think you were a pretty good teacher. That's kind of who the world that's kind of who the world thinks you are. Well, Jesus, there's this group that thinks when they get in trouble, you're the one that they ask to get them out, right? Or when they get sick, you're the one that they say, "Hey, can you kind of step in and do something about this?" Or are you the Peter who says, "And you're the Christ. You are the Christ, the Son of God, and I will follow you"? How are you going to answer that question? If you need to respond, I'm going to ask you to do that while we stand and sing.